should have all received. And if anybody didn't, just let me know and I'll send them to you separately. So anyway, so we looked at the Maccabees and we saw that they were really successful in one of them. Of course, the main success they had was revealing the power of God, you see, because after the revolt of the Maccabees, what we had there was an independent Israel with Jerusalem being the capital of Israel. Okay? So this gave everybody a choice, be circumcised or leave. That was the rule then. So being circumcised, of course, meant taking on the whole law of Moses. In other words, they embrace the whole law of Moses and live by the law of Moses. And that meant all of its rituals and all of the requirements that were in the law. So the country then, we would say, was Judaized. In other words, everybody was made Jewish overnight. That was it, a done deal. So to make sure that God was worshipped the right way, they wanted to make sure that everybody in the country then was Jewish, because they would then follow the law of Moses in the proper way to worship God. So Hyrcanus was the one that also destroyed the temple of the Samaritans then on Mount Gerizim. And in doing so, this earned the Jews the undying hatred of the Samaritans. So they have been long, long, long enemies of each other. So as a military leader then, Hyrcanus conquered almost all the territories that had belonged to the Davidic kingdom. So the amazing restoration was now continuing, because now Israel's territory was once again intact. And it looked as though all of the promises of the prophets were now coming true. But there was only one more logical step, and the successor of Hyrcanus took it. In the year 106 BCE, John Hyrcanus died, and a person by the name of Aristobulus, that's Aristobulus, okay, don't need to remember that name, but this person assumed the office of high priest. And then he did what many people had been waiting for. He proclaimed himself the king. So now it seemed that the promises of the prophets had really been fulfilled, because Israel was whole again, and they once again had a king sitting in Jerusalem, which they wanted from the time of Saul. They wanted to have their own king, just like everybody else. So the one thing that was really wrong was that the king was not a king in the line of David. Right? So Aristobulus and his successors were Levites, and the prophets had all promised that the Lord's anointed would be from the tribe of Judah and the descendants of David. So that becomes a very, very important point, that that bloodline remain intact. So the united Israel now was no easier to keep together than it had been under old Rehoboam's time. Within a very short period of time, Israel became very divided, and it divided between two powerful parties that had grown up, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So they're very divided, with these two parties being right at the top of the problem. So let's take a look at the Pharisees. How could the Jews be faithful to God when Judea was a small province of a huge pagan empire? There was more than one way to answer the question, though. One group of prominent scholars decided that the best way to stay faithful was to build a wall around themselves and keep the Gentiles out. Okay? They were called the separated, which is also in Hebrew Perushim, Perushim. And from that word, we get the word Pharisees. So the goal of the Pharisees was to be separated from the Gentiles, build a wall around themselves. And they felt that this was the only way for the Jews to be faithful and to keep themselves pure, because the law alone wasn't enough. So the Pharisees taught that even the ordinary Jewish families could imitate the complicated and ritualistic purity of the priests in Jerusalem. So they legislated more and more customs and oral traditions. And we'll learn about that because Jesus is constantly correcting them for that. Okay, they put more oral traditions and more rituals like cleaning your hands before meals. And they didn't clean their hands to get rid of dirt, but to get rid of any ritual defilement, you see. So they went beyond the norm as far as putting rules and regulations in place. Now, of course, they refused to associate with the Gentiles. Keep in mind, they want to be separated from them. So they built this wall around them. So they refused to have any connection with them. Even entering a Gentile's house would defile a Jew. Okay? And that's exactly what they taught the people. You were not even to go into their homes. So to distinguish themselves from the Gentiles then, they emphasized and exaggerated their distinctly Jewish customs. They exaggerated them beyond what they should have been. Now, there were good reasons for the Pharisees to believe what they believed. Anyone who knew the history of Israel could see how associating with pagans always led into trouble. It always led to trouble. So that was in their corner. But the Pharisees made the law an intolerable burden for the people. And as time went on, they emphasized the external signs of separation more and more. So among them, there were those who exaggerated the details of Jewish national dress. They wore big phylacteries. Now, phylacteries were those black boxes, or are those black boxes, that if you Googled Jerusalem today, you would see over by the Western Wall, you would see men wearing these black boxes on their heads or on their arms. They were called phylacteries. And so they exaggerated it by wearing bigger ones than they should have. And inside those boxes, they kept verses of sacred scripture, see? And they wore these during their prayer period, the time of their praying, okay? Also, they had the prayer shawls that they wore under their clothes, and they made sure that the fringes that hung from them were conspicuous so everybody could see them. And we'll learn as we go forward in the New Testament that Jesus even called them out on that everybody had to see how holy they were, you know, or how sacred they were trying to be. So they wore these very, very long fringes. And the fringes were commanded by Moses in Numbers 15:38, but they made sure that everyone was noticing who they were. Right? They also made sure that everyone was keeping the Sabbath by the strictest possible interpretation. And they also enforced a strict interpretation of the dietary laws. So at the same time, though, they were perfectly capable of evading the spirit of the law for themselves. So in essence, we had two laws. We had the law for everybody else and the law for the Pharisees. So they found ways that they can kind of skirt the law or kind of lighten the law for themselves, but not for everybody else. So they invented these interpretations that helped them to cheat the poor and even cheat their own parents, okay? And we see Jesus brings this to light in Matthew 23, verse 4-7. He says, they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by men, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues, the salutations in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by men. So they were, I would say, in my terminology, attached to the trappings, okay, attached to the trappings of the order. And I guess they never heard the rule that clothes don't make the man, but that's what they did, you know. So it was the finest of the finest, and make sure everybody saw who you were, and even to the point when they went into the temple, who they were, you know. So that was very, very important to them. See, so though now according to the to Josephus, who is one of the historians of the time. He says that the Jews had three philosophies. One philosophy was of the Essenes. The other philosophy was the Sadducees. And third was the group called the Pharisees. So, as we said, the Pharisees emphasized the external signs of separation from the Gentiles. And among them were those who exaggerated all the details of the Jewish national dress. As I said, the clothing became very, very important. The outward signs became very, very important in every single thing they did. And the Pharisees were the forerunners of the rabbis. See, by applying written Torah to daily life, they made practicing the faith possible in places far from the city. So they had pretty tight control over everything. Now, the Sadducees, they were the party of political power. They were first under the Maccabees, then under the Romans. A council that was called the Sanhedrin made decisions regarding the day-to-day governing of Judah. While the Pharisees had some position in the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees were really the dominant members of the Sanhedrin. So a group of religious Judeans protested the combining of the kingship and the high priesthood by the Maccabees. They believed that the temple under the Sadducees had become hopelessly corrupt. So they moved out of Jerusalem and they established a small community at Qumran. And this is in the desert by the Dead Sea. Their writings, which are known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, that were discovered in the 1940s, they reveal a community that saw themselves as really being pure and righteous. So in comparison to the Sadducees and probably the Pharisees, they really thought they were the righteous ones. As a matter of fact, the findings show that they led a fairly monastic life, the Essenes. Now, there's a theory that John the Baptist was an Essene, but it's not a proven theory. And there's also a theory out there that Jesus was an Essene, and that's not true at all. But that's out there. So when you start to study these different groups, you might find readings that say that, or they will suggest that. But there have been no concrete findings that say that either is true. So a group known as the Zealots also functioned in the first century in Judea. And they may have been the ones that ignited the uprising in 66 AD or 66 BCE, which we'll get to as further on in our studies. And that uprising was similar to the Maccabees revolution, but we're not there yet. We will get to that down the road. So by the time of Jesus now, the Pharisees were extremely powerful. They were a very, very powerful sect. And many of the Jews accepted that the Pharisees were as righteous as they claimed to be. In other words, what they saw was what they really were. But many of the poor resented the heavy burdens of ritual that the Pharisees laid on them. As Jesus said, the burdens were just too hard to carry. And interestingly enough, the Pharisees didn't have to carry them, or they carried a watered down version of whatever they were. They had come up with a successful answer to the question of how the Jewish religion could survive in a Gentile empire. But it was an answer that depended on rejecting the Gentiles completely. They had to forget or to reject the promise of the Davidic covenant and also of the prophets. And that was that Jerusalem would be a center of worship for all nations. That was the prophetic call. Jerusalem was going to be a center for worship for all nations, not just the Jews. So when Jesus came and began to fulfill that promise by, again, drawing the Gentiles to God, the Pharisees immediately recognized that he was preaching a religion that was inclusive, not exclusive. And so they hated him for that. He was only to be directed to them, no one else. Now, on the other side of almost every question then were the Sadducees. They were the heirs of Solomon's priest, a man by the name of Zadok, Zadok. And they were supposed to have been the priests forever in Jerusalem. So they thought that the best way for the Jewish religion to survive was by cooperating with the Gentiles. Now, although the Pharisees were revered by the Jewish public, the Sadducees were the ones who had the most power in the government. So naturally, the Pharisees hated them. See, so the Pharisees were the strict religious leaders, the Sadducees were the powerful government leaders. And so the Sadducees had very different ideas of religion from the Pharisees. For the Sadducees, only the book of Moses, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were canonical scripture. They did not believe in any life after death or in any kind of resurrection from the dead. They did not believe in angels or spirits. And they rejected everything except the Torah, those 5 books. So naturally, the Sadducees rejected all the Pharisees' traditional interpretations and all their additions to the law. It was the first 5 books, that's it, nothing else. And there's a catechism reference for you, section 993, which references Mark 12:27. The Pharisees and many of the Lord's contemporaries hoped for the resurrection. Jesus teaches it firmly. To the Sadducees who deny it, he answers, "Is not this why you are wrong, that you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God?" Okay, so again, they had their own interpretation, very, very strict, of the scriptures, and nothing else was going to break that barrier, break that wall, and come into it. See? So the freedom that was gained under the Maccabees could not last forever. Even if Israel had been united, the great empires of the world would not really have left such a strategically important place alone. And it was strategically important, so it would not have been left alone. But Israel was not united. It was split into warring parties. And that's their history. They're split into warring parties. And the internal dissent was a wedge that outsiders were very willing to use to their advantage. Yes, Dan.
A question. So the Pharisees, Sadducees, I'm just sitting here thinking about this, and maybe you mentioned it, but so would they not have mingled in general in public? Or, you know what I mean? Because they had these differences. And then the other question is, if they're both under the Jewish faith, how did they have their own separate temples almost, or did they kind of come together for that? Because they had a disagreement on the Torah and all that. So how would that have played out with them if they're both claiming the same basis faith, but yet kind of, you know what I mean? I don't, how did they interact with each other?
Well, the first thing we have to remember is that they hated each other. So
okay.
Interaction is not a key word there.
Okay.
They actually hated each other. That was number one. Number two is there was only one temple.
Right.
There was only one temple. So, but they had their interpretation of sacred, you see. And that would not be different than what we have in the Catholic Church today.
Mm-hmm.
We have people in the Catholic Church that are leaning more toward the Church of pre-Vatican II.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the majority of Catholics who are supporting the suggested changes and adjustments of Vatican II. Now, I'm not saying that there's a hatred like we have between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but you have these different elements
mm-hmm.
in the Catholic faith. Now, in the Jewish tradition there, keep in mind that the followers of Jesus, the term Christian was not used in those days. So anyone who followed Jesus, that sect, if you want to put it, came under the Jewish, it was under the Jewish umbrella. It was a form of Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And I compare that to us having like the charismatic movement in the Catholic Church. There's a movement in the church that's recognized. Now, they didn't like it, but following Jesus in the day, until we get to the part when they get tossed out of the temple, but following Jesus in the day, that was under the umbrella of Judaism, you see. So even they were in there, not liked, but in there. So, but there was only ever one temple, and that's in Jerusalem. Now there were synagogues in the various cities, but one temple. And again, my guess would be, and this would be an educated guess, the temple area was so large that I would suggest that when the Sadducees had their worship in the temple, they probably had a section that they worshiped in, so that they were not worshiping at the same time or in the same space as the Pharisees, since they believed in one thing and the Pharisees believed in another. The interesting thing today, too, is when you go over to the Holy Land, and you go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, on the floor of the church, and even up the columns, if you can see it, because it's dimly lit in there, but on the floor of the church and up the columns, you see lines, black lines. Those are territorial marks for the different faith traditions that worship in there. And so if you are, let's say the Catholic group is there, don't let your foot go over on the other side during worship period, because you don't belong there. And that's true. And every once in a while, you will read in the paper or see on the news where some fights have broken out. As a matter of fact, when I was finishing my thesis, which is the book that is out there on the Via Dolorosa, and I feel like I'm on one of the talk shows. Go buy my book, But no, I make reference to there because the night before I was to turn in the final manuscript, lo and behold, a fight broke out in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the monks were beating each other with brooms because they had crossed the line during prayer time. Now, the professor that I had was so particular, I knew that if I didn't include that fight, okay, I would have a problem. So I had to rewrite one of the last chapters there to slide in that fight that just happened. And of course, he was very pleased to see that. But then as I followed it along in the news, yeah, the monks were taken to the hospital because they had bruises and whatnot, and then promptly arrested because they crossed the line, so to speak. And we had an interesting situation, I want to say on our last visit there, in that you're not allowed to sing in there at all, because every group has their own chanting and whatnot. So we were celebrating Mass. And of course, in our faith tradition, the Alleluia before the gospel is always sung. So we started to sing it. And one of the friars who was in charge of the area we were in, went ballistic. No, 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 no. He's screaming, stop, stop, stop. We had to stop. No singing permitted at all. You see, so it's very, very strict even today when you go in there. Now, luckily, when the tourists are there, is not during their official prayer time of those different groups. Otherwise, there would be chaos like crazy. But as I said, when you look around, now, if I didn't tell you that, you probably wouldn't notice it. But if you went on our trip to the Holy Land and you went into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and you really started to look around, you would see these black lines and you realize that there's all these territories. So my guess is the same thing. I mean, the temple did have the court of the women, and the court of the Gentiles was on the outside. They had the court of the priests. So they had all these different courts, you see. But you have to keep in mind that the Sadducees and the Pharisees absolutely hated, underscore hated. So you can get an idea that they're not going to interact pretty much with anything at all, so you're not going to have that situation. See, so so Israel, again, as I just said, they were not united at all. And everyone was willing to take use of that weakness, the outsiders, take use of that particular weakness to their own advantage. So even the kings contributed to the disunity. More than once, the throne was disputed by rival family members, which then again led to civil war and chaos. So Israel has had a long, long history of chaos and civil war and infighting. So it's nothing new. And so that's why when we see today what's going on in Israel, this is part of their history. They have had a very, very difficult time in their history with getting along. The outside tribes coming in. And if you look at Israel too, the reason why they're so concerned about their territory being protected, I would say that Israel is almost like Johnstown. If you look at Johnstown, it's like a teacup, where the city of Johnstown is Well, this is typical of Israel. So they're concerned that they have this land because any of their enemies can surround them and crush them at any time. That's the reality of it. So when you look at that, you see, and that goes back to the early time, to the very early times. And that's why they're so concerned about that territory, and that is to protect themselves because they're basically trapped in this area. You see, and as I said, Johnstown is a great analogy because Johnstown, it's proper, sits in a teacup surrounded by all these mountains. So if you picture that, and you picture that all of your enemies can then surround you at any given time, well, you're just like sitting ducks. You see, so again, that becomes very important. So they have a history of civil war and chaos. So now Rome, the new superpower in the Mediterranean, expands now into Palestine. And Judea fell without much of a fight. So at first, the Jewish kings kept their throne as Roman tributaries. But in the year 40, okay, in the year 40 BC, and a very ambitious, a very ruthless, history calls him a thug, okay, Herod the Great managed to persuade the Romans to give him the throne of Judea. And he established himself on the throne by taking over Jerusalem, okay? And he does that with an army of about 60,000 soldiers to support him. And he massacres many of the residents in Jerusalem. And that set the tone for his very long reign. It was really a bloody tyranny that would inflame the anti-Roman hatred, of which there was much, okay, of the population, that would inflame that hatred of those who did not look with any favor upon the Romans. So let's take a look at Herod. Okay. By almost any standard, by a lot of the historians and theologians that wrote about him, Herod was insane. That's there's your operative word there. He was insane. He murdered 3 of his own sons in such horrible ways that one Roman general actually said he would rather be Herod's pig than Herod's son. Okay, so that gives you the idea of what this man was like. But he was kind of sly and slick and crafty. He knew how to grab power, but he also knew how to keep power. And the Romans really cared very little about how many of the people he murdered, as long as he kept the tribute, okay, the Roman tribute, flowing into Rome on schedule. You know, in other words, the monies and whatnot that had to be paid. As long as everything was on schedule, and they didn't really care what he did. He could do whatever he wanted, you see. So just to make sure, though, Herod always sent very lavish gifts to the prominent Romans, kind of like greasing the wheel. You know, he wanted to keep in favor with them. So he always made sure that the best of the best was sent to them as a gift from him. Interesting thing is, Herod was not even Jewish, but he did his best to look like a Davidic king. He was an Edomite, okay, who were, again, enemies of Israel. And he spread the story that he was actually a Jew returned from the exile. And he rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem on a magnificent scale. As a matter of fact, today they are excavating there Herod's temple area. That's going on now. I believe that it started in earnest about a year or 2 ago, and you could probably find that on the internet. Those of you who get the magazine Biblical Archaeology, there was an issue a couple of issues ago that focused on that's what they're working on right now, as well as the city of David. So it's very interesting to follow that, to see what they find. So he rebuilt this temple in really a magnificent scale. He had many wives, just like Solomon. And he was also very careful to subsidize the temple priests very generously. So again, he knew how to take care of those that he had to take care of to make sure he kept everything in order. So he kept subsidizing the temple priests. And so that meant that most of the very influential temple priests supported So he had the support from them. Okay, everyone was taken care of. Now, he might have been ruthless, but he knew how to spend money. He was a very talented architect, or at least he took credit, okay, for the work of the architects that put his buildings together, but he built magnificent palaces and fortresses and public buildings all over his kingdom. And we're going to see that unravel as we follow the excavations over there now, as they're excavating the temple area, Herod's temple and Herod's palace and whatnot. We're going to be seeing that. So his greatest work, obviously, as I just said, was the new temple. By all accounts, it was more glorious even than Solomon's. And it was such a spectacle, though, that people or pilgrims came from all over the known world just to see it. Okay? In Acts chapter 8, we read of a wealthy court official who had come all the way from Ethiopia just to see it. And while the people were there, they spent their money in Jerusalem, which helped keep the economy healthy. So they had a good cash flow going on from that as well. Big tourist city, well, as it is today, big tourist city as it is today. And in fact, the combination of Roman peace, worldwide trade, and Herod's expensive building programs brought an economic boom like Israel had never seen before. So you had three elements there, you see. You had it was peaceful, the golden period of Rome was peaceful. Worldwide trade was growing. And again, Herod always had some major project going on at the time, which employed people. And when you have people employed and they're making money, they're spending money. And so the economy is doing extremely well. So it must have seemed to the Jews that the prophet's promises were finally being fulfilled. That, hey, everything is going cool here. This is really great. What the prophet said was going to happen is happening. But keep in mind, Herod was really a bloody tyrant. Okay? But when God had, he was a bloody tyrant, really, when God had other, how do I want to put it? God insisted on perfection according to following the commandments of God. And Herod was the flip side of that coin, okay? Herod is basically just a bloody tyrant. Even David committed the sin of adultery. You see, so again, that common thread of sin runs through everybody, runs through the line of David as well. But Israel now was united and rich. And the temple, as I said, was more glorious than ever. And the people were coming from all over the place to see Jerusalem. So they looked at Herod thinking that perhaps Herod now was the promised Messiah. And so he would be known as Herod the Great. So when you see reference to him in any books or articles you're reading, Herod the Great, that's our man. Not because he was universally admired, but because his reign was so prosperous in comparison with his successors that he was given the title Herod the Great. Okay? So when he died, the Romans split his kingdom 4 ways among his surviving sons. In Greek, the split kingdom was called the Tetrarchy. It's Tetrarchy. And that means rule of 4. And you might see that again, if you do some additional reading on your own, you might see that word there. That's what it means, the rule of 4. And so Herod Antipas, Antipas, he was one of Herod the Great's sons that ruled over Galilee during the ministry of Jesus. Now, in your handouts, you have a family tree. Herod's family tree, I believe, is in your handouts. Okay. So by the end of Herod's reign, by the end of his time, many of the Jews were still expecting the Messiah. But many others were convinced that Herod's temple represented the divine fulfillment of prophecy. So, and debating parties, the squabbling parties, the arguing parties, were still squabbling and debating and arguing, okay? And occasional terrorist raids actually disrupted the tranquility of the province. But Herod had an iron fist, and he was backed by Rome, you see. So he's backed by the world's greatest power. So he managed to keep order most of the time. It wasn't too difficult for him. So this was the world then in which Christ was born. This is the world in which the Messiah came, signifying what you hear or you read about or you hear said, the fullness of time. He enters the fullness of time, our time. Okay? And in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4 to 5, we read, but when the time had fully come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. So he enters the fullness of time. So why had the time fully come for the incarnation? Well, for one thing, the political state of the world was remarkably stable at that particular time. So after decades of war after war after war, a large part of the civilized world was under the control of one great world empire, and that was Rome. So the Roman peace, again, this is known as Pax Romana in Latin, the Roman peace was just beginning when Jesus was born, and it would last for hundreds of years. It would last for hundreds of years. So when Caesar Augustus defeated Pompey and Mark Antony, he became sole ruler of most of the known world. And he began a period of relative peace that, as I said, would last for centuries. So by the time the Christian church began to spread, it was possible to travel from Britain to Arabia without ever leaving the boundaries of the empire. So that gives you an idea of how big the empire was. So in many ways, travel was easier in the Roman Empire at that time than it is in the same area now. You know, we can get from one place to another faster, but the Romans had no borders to cross, no checkpoints to be concerned about, no currency conversions to calculate. If you travel over there now, you have exactly what I just mentioned. You have checkpoints and you have currency differences and you have borders that have to be crossed, you know. So from Spain to Palestine and from Britain to Africa, it was all one great empire. So you had none of that. And it had the same currency and the same laws. So you didn't have to worry about stepping into another area now and you have a whole other set of laws as you do today. If you go into any other country than the United States, when you step into those countries, you have to abide by the laws of those countries. And in my career, I had the privilege of being able to travel to different parts of the world. And we were always told, we always received our instructions from the State Department, depending on where we were going. And we were always told or reminded that when we step off the plane, we are the foreigners, which is odd for us because, hey, yeah, we're the Americans, you know, so we can do whatever we want. And they always reminded us that, remember, when you step off that plane, you are in another country and you have to abide by their laws. And if you break their laws, the US government might not be able to help you. You know, so be careful. Well, back in the day, they didn't have that. You go wherever you want. You had no problem whatsoever. You had no borders. There was one law, and the only problem that you had there was that although the Roman Empire was politically stable, the religion was crumbling into irrelevance. In other words, people didn't really care. As far as religion, it was kind of okay, fine. You know, it was not what it was in the day. So let's take a look at religion in the Roman Empire. Well, religion in the Roman Empire was very businesslike. If you celebrated the right ceremonies for the right gods at the right time with the right words, then you expected that the gods would be happy with you. And if the gods were happy with you, then everything would go well in your life. Any deeper involvement with the gods was only superstition to the Romans. Now, this kind of smacks of what we would call today theology. In other words, if you're doing everything right, God is going to take care of you, and that's fine. And if you have any problems in your life, it's because you have either sinned or you're living against the law of God or whatever. That smacks of what we call prosperity theology. So as long as the people kept the peace and they followed a few very simple rules, the Romans said, "Hey, worship any god you want. It's fine. You're out of here." The Romans themselves often paid tribute to the local gods of the people that they conquered. That was just a normal thing. Augustus, who was the emperor when Jesus was born, had sacrifices offered for himself at the temple in Jerusalem, which you would think would be highly unusual, but he did. For him, the God of the Jews was just one more local god with a small g to be appeased. Just another god, in the basket of many gods that were worshipped. So many philosophers did not believe in the traditional Roman or Greek gods at all. Some thought that there were gods, but they were too far above us to really be bothered with us, to care about us. In other words, we were a non-issue to them. So many others believe that in this again, that this wrestling with how many gods were there and how many did they really care for us, they believed in a single cause first. In other words, one God, which we call monotheism, the belief of only one God. So you had that going on as well. Those who believed in only one God and those who believed that, yeah, there's a lot of them, but there's kind of a ranking, and the ones that are really at the top don't have time for us. They don't really pay much attention to us, you see. So without God's own revelation, well, they would never know God, even though they knew he existed. But unless he revealed himself somehow to them, they would never know him, you see. But the philosophers helped prepare the way for God's revelation when it came through Jesus Christ. And there's a catechism reference for you there too, number 35. And it says, man's faculties make him capable of coming to a knowledge of the existence of a personal God. But for man to be able to enter into real intimacy with him, God willed both to reveal himself to man and give him the grace of being able to welcome this revelation in faith. Proofs of God's existence, however, can predispose one to faith and help one see that faith is not opposed to reason. And I've said that before. The Catholic Church teaches that you cannot separate faith and reason. So what we cannot prove or what we do not understand through reason, we believe by faith. That's why the Catholic Church says you can't separate the two. See, during the Renaissance period, the enlightened period of enlightenment, during the period of enlightenment, what they said was they leaned more toward the sciences. So if you couldn't prove it, it didn't exist. So faith took a back seat, or pretty much it was really watered down, and everybody focused on reason only. But then the Catholic Church said, well, no, you cannot separate faith and reason, because there are things about our faith, mysteries about our faith that we do not understand, but we believe them, by faith. We cannot scientifically reason them out. Even the scientists, when they go through their many, many exercises of trying to prove the existence of God, they all reach a certain point where they have to stop, because they just can't, they can't get the scientific proof. So they can take you all the way back, so all to the Big Bang Theory, or whatever it is they want to call it, you see. But then there's always, if there was this Big Bang, who created the Big Bang? You see, so again, the Catholic Church says faith and reason can't be separated. So, but all over the empire, people were searching for answers to the most important questions. In other words, how can I have eternal life? How can I be free from sin? How can I know God? And these were questions that the Roman religion had no answers for, none. And they're the same questions that we have today, but the Roman religion had nothing, you see. So what did the people do? Well, the people turned to other religions, especially the religions from the East. So the city of Rome was soon cluttered with temples to many foreign gods. Isis came from Mithra from Persia, and even the God of Abraham from Palestine. So there were gods pretty much littered all over the place. Now, many of the educated Romans kind of thumbed their nose. They looked down on these new religions as pretty much superstitious nonsense, you see. A Jew might believe it, was how they put it. They might believe it, but they, for the most part, thought most of the things were unbelievable. Most of the educated Romans also didn't believe in the Roman gods either. So it wasn't just that they were looking at the God of the Jewish people, the God of the Hebrews, as being something strange. They didn't recognize any of the others, you see. But even though they didn't recognize them, they still had that inborn need, that desire to know God. Who is this? That search. And so that search has gone on in our lives from day one, and continues to today. So let's take a look now at the spread of the Jewish religion here. And we have 3 points here. The Jewish neighborhoods appeared in every town of the Roman Empire. The Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek. That's a very, very important point here. That was the common language of the eastern part of the empire. And the liturgy of the word comes from the ancient synagogue liturgy. But we always refer to our Judeo-Christian roots, right? Because it comes from the ancient synagogue liturgy. So the dispersion of the Jews, the spreading out of the Jews, also prepared the way for the coming of the Christ. Now, remember that only a small remnant, as scripture tells us, a small remnant had come back to Jerusalem after the exile. So many of the Jews were doing very well in Babylon or in Egypt. They saw no reason to abandon their homes and businesses to go back home to their ancestors. So they stayed. Later, when Alexander the Great conquered the East, they spread all over his empire. Alexandria in Egypt became second only to Jerusalem as the center of Jewish culture. So Alexandria becomes the focal point. So when the Romans took over, the Jewish merchants continued to settle everywhere until there was hardly a town in the Roman Empire without a Jewish neighborhood. Now, one historian calculates that the Jews made up as much as 7% of the population of the empire, and that's a very significant minority. We know that at the time of Christ, the city of Rome itself had about 10,000 Jewish men, not counting women, because we read about that in scripture, where Jesus preached to 10,000 men, not including women and not including children. And Alexandria, the second city of the empire, as I just said, was probably at least a quarter Jewish. So even though some of these Jews that were kind of on the outskirts, the far-flung areas, even though they forgot their native language, they never forgot the scriptures. They never forgot the scriptures. So by the time of Jesus, the complete Old Testament now had been translated into Greek, the language that almost everyone spoke now in the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And this was called the Septuagint. It's Septuagint, right? That's the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, right? So again, for the Greek-speaking Jews, that was their way of being able to get sacred scripture, because they obviously didn't read Hebrew. And if you are reading some theological books, you might come across the Roman numeral LXX. LXX means Septuagint as well. It's an abbreviation for it. And what the LXX means in Roman numerals, that's 70. And 70 scholars were the ones that completed the translation work of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. So when you see LXX, that's a quick reference to the Septuagint. So they might not spell it out. So you might see that in some of your readings, but that's what it means. See? So as I said, 70 scholars worked on it. And when the New Testament quotes from the Old Testament, usually in the words of the Septuagint, because Greek was the language of the day. So when they're quoting from the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. So synagogues then first appeared during the exile, when the people of God could no longer get to the temple in Jerusalem to make their sacrifices. So they had to go somewhere to pray. So we start to see the synagogues dotting the landscape. Even after the exiles returned and rebuilt the temple, the communities that were a distance kept their synagogues, just as we keep our parish churches all over the world. They kept their synagogues all over the world. And the synagogues were very close to where the people lived in town, because the rule was that on the Sabbath, you couldn't do any work, and you can only travel as far as the synagogue and back. So you're not going to find the synagogue 20 miles or 30 miles from your house. You're going to find it right there. As a matter of fact, in Capernaum, where Peter's house is, you can hit the synagogue with a stone. That's how close it is. So you're at Peter's house, and you look right out there, and where Jesus taught is right there. Not a 2-minute walk from the door of Peter's house is the synagogue, and that was true of the towns, because of the law that you could not travel a distance. You can only travel to and from the synagogue. So we see in the towns lots of synagogues dotting the landscape. So again, the people maintain their synagogues, and these synagogues. When you look at and you can Google anything I'm telling you about. You can Google nowadays and see it. You can just Google the synagogue in Capernaum, and you'll see it. These were huge. These were not small little, like a little hut of a church. These were synagogues. These were the substantial buildings where the people went to worship. See, so the interesting thing here is that when the faithful met every week, their service was very much like our liturgy of the word. It was very much like the first part of our Mass. Our Mass splits into 2 parts. We have the liturgy of the word, which goes on up to and including the homily. When that ends, we have the liturgy of the Eucharist. And that goes from that period up to and including the dismissal. So it splits in 2. That's why when we have special liturgical events like a confirmation or an ordination or a wedding, or when does it take place? It actually takes place during that gap time when the liturgy of the word is over and the liturgy of the Eucharist is about to begin. That's when that particular liturgy is inserted. That's why you see it, that just in case why you see that happening, in case you ever wondered as to why all of a sudden after the homily, well, the bishop goes and he starts the confirmation or whatever it is that that we're doing. Well, that's the appropriate time in our service. So again, as I said, the service there was very much like our liturgy of the word. They would hear a reading from the law, which would be from one of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Then they heard a reading from the prophets, in which they heard God's promise to send a Messiah, and the Messiah was going to free them from their bondage and restore the kingdom of Israel. After that, a speaker might give what we would call a homily today. That was the structure. And we do exactly the same thing. We always have a reading from the Old Testament. Okay. We have a reading from the prophets. We have a psalm response, you see, and then we have a homily. Right? So Christians have kept that liturgy, that synagogue liturgy, with one important difference. We proclaim as Christians that the Messiah has already come. So when Jesus told the congregation in Nazareth that they had seen the scriptures fulfilled on that day, that's Luke 4:16-21, when Jesus opens up the scroll of Isaiah, reads it, and then says, today you've heard this, in your presence you've heard this, he marks the change from the Old Testament worship to the Christian worship. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, so let's take a look at what we would call the proselytes of the gate. All right, Judaism appealed to many Gentiles in the Roman Empire. The proselytes of the gate were Gentile converts. They had converted to Judaism, but they were not circumcised. That brings a big discussion later on with St. Paul. So these proselytes of the gate knew enough of the scriptures to recognize Jesus as the Christ. But as I said, they were not circumcised. So because Romans all over the empire were constantly searching for new religions, many of them turned to the Jews because Judaism became another of the fashionable Eastern religions that was popular among all classes of people in the empire. So to be a full member of the Jewish community, you had to be circumcised and you had to obey all of the dietary laws. But there was an intermediate step. You could be attached to the Jewish community without being fully Jewish. And so these intermediate people were called, the term that I'm using here, the proselytes of the gate. They went to worship at the synagogues. They learned all about the Hebrew scriptures. And although they weren't full members of the Jewish community, they expected to have some share in the future kingdom when the Christ came. So when the early Christians started to spread the good news, they made many converts in the Jewish communities, and that was everywhere, all over. But they made even more converts among the proselytes of the gate. So wherever the apostles went, they found pockets of God-fearing Gentiles who knew the scriptures and understood how Jesus fulfilled the scriptures. Then those Gentiles would take the good news back to their families and friends and make more converts. So you can see how the gospel spread so fast. They would take it back and they would meet with their family and friends, and they would listen to it and they would accept it and they would take it back to their family. So it grew and it grew and it grew very quickly, very quickly. You know, if we look at the book of Acts, chapter 13, 16 to 41, we see a good example of how St. Paul preached a sermon to both Jews and proselytes. He addresses them as men of Israel, and you that fear God. He says, and brethren, sons of the family of Abraham, and those among you that fear God. In other words, there are two groups in his audience, Jews and God-fearing Gentiles. So he expects both to know the story of Exodus, both to know the stories of Saul, both to know the stories of David. And in the end, many of the Gentiles were glad and they glorified the word of God. If they didn't understand all of Paul's references to scriptures, they never would have understood his message. And so you had a mix of people at that particular time. And with that mix of people, you see tremendous growth of the church. So you have these areas of Judea and Galilee. Now, Judea is the southern part of Palestine, the southern part of Palestine. It was settled by the exiles who returned from Babylon. Now, some Jewish settlers also moved into Galilee, which is in the north. And so Rome left Palestine under the rule of the Herods. They ruled Palestine. So Palestine was part of the great Roman Empire in the time of Jesus, and it was one of the more troublesome parts. It was full of rebels who were always trying to start a revolution against the Romans. Sometimes one of the rebels would claim to be the Christ. And then the Romans would have to send in the legions to put down the disturbance, to keep the peace. So when the Jewish remnant had returned from exile in Babylon, they settled around Jerusalem. And this is roughly in the old territory of the kingdom of Judah. So the Romans called that area Judea. That's how it's got its name. And the inhabitants were known as Judeans, or as we would call them, Jews. Now, some Jewish settlers also moved into Galilee. And they moved into the land that had been the northern part of the kingdom of Israel. Now, Galilee was already inhabited by Israelites. These were the descendants of the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali. And these are the tribes also that had not been deported with the rest of Israel. So it was pretty much kind of a pleasant land, nice little small towns, poor, not wealthy, poor, but they were honest farmers. The Jews, though, in Jerusalem, thought when they looked at the Galileans, they thought that they were no better than peasants. So when Jews from all over the world came to Jerusalem for religious festivals, you could always tell the Galileans by their accent. You could always tell them by their accent. And we hear reference to that in Peter's denial. How do they know that he's again? They pick up his accent right away. Right? So that's how we know, or that's how they knew. So, as they often did, the Romans left the kings pretty much nominally in charge. In other words, if there's no issue, if there are no problems going on, leave it be. Although the indigenous people, they had to answer to a Roman governor. But the Romans were sensitive, as they put it, sensitive to the Jewish traditions. They didn't really want to upset these people, so they were sensitive to their traditions. So when Jesus was born, the king in charge was Herod the Great. And he would murder every infant under 2 in Bethlehem in an effort to kill Jesus. I mentioned Capernaum before, and Capernaum is it's on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. So after leaving Nazareth, Jesus made it the home of his ministry. And as I mentioned, there's a synagogue there of white limestone, and it's built on the foundation of the synagogue that dates back to the early 1st century, which is what you see over there. You see the churches and synagogues are built on top of the ancient buildings. Even the house of Peter, what sits on you see the house of Peter, but what sits above it is this huge, beautiful church. And it's not destroying the house of Peter, but it's raised up like on pylons, and it sits right above the house of Peter. And so when you're up in the church, you can actually look down on through the glass floor, and you can see the house of Peter from the church. It's really quite beautiful. But again, this synagogue that I'm mentioning is built on the foundation of the 1st century synagogue.